Thank you. Thank you very much. It's nice to be here. I will first try and see if the clicker works, and it does. Yeah, it's cool to be here. Thank you for having me, and thank you for being here. I just realized a moment ago, when I got here, that I have the privilege of speaking during the food coma slot. And I take it as a challenge. I will try and keep it engaging. I think it's a very important topic, so let's get right into it. The question is, what can Europe do to get closer to the frontier in AI? And there's obviously 100 things that could be done and should be done probably. I want to focus on two things, infrastructure and regulatory environment. And I picked these two because I think, so A, they're important, and B, I also hope that my perspectives and what I'm going to share with you feels at least a bit controversial maybe for some of you, or thought-provoking. That's at least the hope, that we can have that we can contribute to a lively debate around this important question. First, some stage setting. We're talking about the frontier of AI. That is very much a moving target because AI capabilities have been progressing very rapidly. And the first potentially controversial thing I want to claim is that, contrary to what some of the commentary has been saying that I have read in recent weeks or months, I don't think we see strong evidence of AI progress slowing down. So GPT-5 launched recently, and I've seen some headlines and some takes on Twitter or LinkedIn saying, oh, now the slowdown has arrived. I'm not so sure. There might be some dimension of slowdown, but I think the jury is out, and that's why I wanted to share this chart with you. This is by Meter, a US-based independent evaluation org. And what we're seeing on this, in this figure is, on the y-axis, the duration that it usually takes human workers to perform a given task in the domain, important caveat, in the domain of software engineering. So we are talking about a pretty narrow domain. And on the y-axis, we see the duration that it usually takes humans, professionals, to perform a given task. And on the x-axis, we see time and large language model release dates. And the data points that we see show us, at each given point in time, how well was the leading LLM doing on this metric. Could it only solve tasks that take human software engineers up to 2 seconds, but for any longer tasks, performance breaks down, and the LLM cannot handle them anymore? Or can it do longer tasks that humans take longer for? And what we see there is not just a clear upwards trend, but we see an exponential trend. So the doubling time here has been around 7 months. And I think recently it's even been tightening a little bit. And so we see GPT-5, which I have seen some people write about. Oh, GPT-5 is a disappointment. It's the first sign of the slowdown. We see GPT-5 is actually above the trend here. Now again, I want to caveat it. It's a pretty narrow domain. People have been starting to do this sort of analysis for other types of tasks in other domains, and they're seeing similar trends, though. And the overall message, so this is just one provocative sort of counter piece of potential evidence I wanted to give to some of the narrative I've been seeing. But the bigger picture for me here is, it's at least conceivable and possible that this trend continues in some way. And of course, nobody knows. The only correct answer about AI progress is nobody knows. But I think this sort of evidence should give us pause and should let us at least consider the possibility that we end up in a world where in just a few years, trends like this will have continued, and we will have AIs that are able to carry out tasks that would take human workers not 2 hours, but maybe 24 hours or even a couple of days. And maybe not just in this narrow domain that is a particularly easy one for AI, software engineering, but potentially also in other domains. That, I think, is very important for anybody thinking about the future of AI, and also for anybody thinking about how we can get Europe closer to the frontier of AI, because in a couple of years, the frontier of AI might be very, very far from where it is today, and we might have AIs that can perform these tasks that take human workers days or maybe even weeks. So let's stay with that possibility, and let's think about what happens if things do go in that direction, and if we do end up in those scenarios in just a few years from now. What will that mean for Europe? I recently wrote an op-ed about this question together with Professor Monika Schnitzer, the chairwoman of the Wirtschaftsweisen, which is the chief economic advisory council to the German government. And our conclusion, we asked ourselves this exact question: what happens if in a few years from now we really get to this very powerful AI that nobody, I think, can rule out at this stage? And our conclusion is things look very, very, very grim for Germany, and I think you could say basically we could have written the exact same article about Europe. Things look very grim if we end up in that scenario for us as a region. And a key reason, that was our argument, is that in that kind of world, intelligence becomes this thing that is just almost arbitrarily available, copyable, scalable, applicable to all sorts of contexts. And then what you as a country or a region can deploy of that intelligence will determine much of your economic power and your political power in the world. Because if somebody suddenly has intelligence available almost arbitrarily to an arbitrary degree and can scale it big time and use it economically and create value, but you cannot do that, then you're in deep, deep trouble. And one of the main reasons our projection here, at least for the current trajectory that we're on, was pretty grim, has to do with infrastructure and with computing power. So this is a figure from compiled by AIDAQ AI. And we see here, it's quite interesting and a little surprising maybe. If we go back 3 years ago, so this was roughly the big first ChatGPT moment. Back then, we had the United States and China more or less on par when it came to the share of global GPU sort of performance that they had divided among themselves. Europe, you can't see the numbers now, but it was roughly at 10%. Now, 3 years forward, we see the US has completely crushed everybody else, including China, and including, importantly for a European audience, and painfully so, Europe. And so we're now at, I think, 4.8% on this chart. So the trend does not look good for scenarios in which intelligence becomes almost indefinitely scalable. And the main bottleneck to how much you can do that is how much compute do you have? How much can you actually deploy it? Or do you just have the model, but you can't really put it to use? So the trend so far, bad news. Now people have noticed this and have become increasingly aware of it, including in the EU. And so I have noticed German policymakers, European policymakers talk more about compute in the recent months. And of course, I think many of you might have heard of the big announcements on AI gigafactories, which I'm sure at some point we'll talk about here today or tomorrow. So there is a sense of, yeah, we really need to do something. The problem is, we've seen the trend of the last few years, and that our global share has been declining quite dramatically. The problem with these announcements or the current ambitions, if you as Europe are concerned about, or as a European one is concerned about increasing that share again, the problem is that even the announcements pale in comparison to what the rest of the world is doing. Don't worry too much about every word on this table, in this table. The big takeaway is, so this is also by AIDAQ AI, highly recommend their data sets on AI compute. This is a table showing planned AI supercomputers or supercomputers that are already in construction, but it's mostly planned ones. And they're ordered here by size. So let's see if this works, yeah. An interesting column to look at is this one. It shows H100 equivalents. So basically, how many powerful chips, how much computing power does this project actually have? What is planned or what is being built? And they're ordered along this column. And you might notice that the much hyped and announced European gigafactories don't even show up here. I wasn't able to fit them, and still have the biggest ones. So the gigafactories are somewhere between rank 30 and 35, I think, and they have 100,000 H100 equivalents each. So it's 4 or 5 of these with each 100,000 H100 equivalents. And then you look at the biggest projects in the world that people are building elsewhere, and some of them are even 200 times the size. But even if you don't look at these outliers, it's orders of magnitude. So the trend so far has been concerning. Our share of the global pie has been shrinking, and now even with the recent announcements that we've seen, they should not make us as Europeans optimistic that this will change. I think by default, this will further shrink the global share. Okay, and then concluding this part, remember I told you I was going to talk about infrastructure for frontier AI and then also the regulatory environment. Not very surprisingly, probably, my conclusion on the compute topic is we urgently need more compute. And I think that is, there's a lot of nuance to this, and I do want to acknowledge this. I'm aware that it's not as simplistic, it's not the silver, the bullet that solves everything for you. And there are also valid arguments for why a certain company, however big, might say, oh, this investment just doesn't feel warranted for us. I'm aware of these things. But if we take scenarios seriously in which AI progresses very rapidly and then the ability to deploy that intelligence at scale through computing power will become key to even taking part in any global competition. In those scenarios, I think we're in a terrible place by default if things continue this way. And so, hence my conclusion, we need more compute. And then a lot of things would be needed for that and will be needed for that to actually end up being a successful endeavor. We need a completely different attitude towards it. So I use the term warp speed here. You can use whatever you want instead of it. I use the German word Chefsache. So I think the top leadership at the European and at the national government levels would have to make AI and this infrastructure topic one of their key priorities, maybe even a legacy issue of their time and power for this to really work in the way I think it needs to work if we are serious about catching up. We can build our gigafactories with sort of business as usual mindset, and then in I don't know how many years they will exist. If we're serious about catching up and increasing our share, I think many, many other things need to change as well. Right, and then that will have to be supported by support for the European AI ecosystem, so that these gigafactories don't end up being there idle and not being used. Something that I care about a lot is also I think we need more top technical expertise in government to support the policymakers that are already working on it. One country that has shown in a pretty impressive way how this can be done is the UK. They were able to recruit, in the last 2 years, I think, 70 technical AI researchers, some of them from the leading companies, from OpenAI, from Anthropic, from DeepMind. They're now working in government, and with their technical expertise, they're helping the government think about these strategies and implement them well. And much more will be needed. Okay, so this is the infrastructure part and the bigger one of the two that I wanted to talk about. I also want to touch briefly on the regulatory environment and leave you with a somewhat more positive note. I think when it comes to the very frontier of AI and European regulation, we've actually seen a success story recently. People debate about the AI Act a lot. The part about the AI Act that applies only to frontier AI are the obligations around systemic risk. And systemic risk is defined in a way in the AI Act that it becomes clear that it really only applies to the companies pushing the frontier outwards, so the Metas, the OpenAIs, and so on. A handful, maybe 2 handful of companies. And there I think the EU actually got something very, very right. This could have gone poorly with a field that is moving that quickly. But the Commission decided to have independent experts write a code of practice with input from the entire AI community, including companies, civil society, academics, iterate on it for 9 months, and then make that the blueprint or like an operationalization of the obligations in the AI Act. I think that has gone really well. You shouldn't take my word for it, though. I'm incredibly biased because I was one of the chairs writing this thing. But there is some more evidence that this went well and it was a success. And the evidence is that many, or most, almost all of the actual frontier companies for which this is relevant because they have to deal with these obligations, almost all of them signed this part of the code of practice that is about frontier regulation. Microsoft, OpenAI, Mistral, notably xAI, which for all the other parts said, oh, we don't want any of this, and which is doesn't have a reputation exactly for embracing any regulation, especially from the EU. They also signed it. So I think here we've actually seen an example of how things can work if technical people get involved and if the entire community gets consulted. You can come up with regulatory frameworks about which the companies will say, oh, we're actually somewhat optimistic that this can stand the test of time and that it can be future-proof and workable. What can we learn from this? What can the EU learn from this? So one of the top 3 AI companies in the world that signed this part of the code, they said, if thoughtfully implemented, the code will enable Europe to harness the most significant technology of our time to power and innovation and competitiveness. And the part I want to stress is this, if thoughtfully implemented. And it gets us back to technical talent and some of the things I said earlier. And so I left you with a conclusion on infrastructure and what is needed there. I think what is needed for a successful regulatory regime in Europe for frontier AI is a bunch of things, and I'm running out of time, but I'm going to highlight 2 or 3. So one is dramatically increasing the staffing that they have available and the technical staff that they have available, because if you don't have these technical people, you will not be able to implement these rules in a sensible way. And then the last one I want to highlight is a technical foresight unit. So one issue that I think many governments have, including the German government and the European Commission and many others in Europe, is they don't have a technical AI foresight unit whose only job it is to scan what is going on at the frontier of capabilities and what might happen 6 months from now, 12 months from now, 18 months from now, and what that means for government work. Most of the time, everybody is needed in meeting deadlines, running around, putting out fires. The UK actually, again, has been able to put this in place, and this has helped them, I think, in having a much more forward-looking approach on AI. So I want to leave you with this quote that we, as the chairs writing this code of practice, left the Commission with once we handed them the code of practice back to them. We said AI is likely the defining technology of our time, and Europe cannot afford to get this wrong. It takes stepping up to this challenge. And all of these things, and this applies to the compute also, I think would be the necessary starting point for Europe to have a chance of leading the way to getting AI right. Thank you.